And welcome to another edition of Trader Talk TV. And today we have Ben from Publica again on our edition of Trader Talk TV. We're doing this virtual because Ben's in the west coast of the States and I am on location, secret location, obviously. So we're doing this off the back of Ben's initial successful world-beating, epoch-defining Trader Talk TV about addressable television and the guts of it, because we went into the back end of how all things work, SSAI and all the rest, and it was an amazingly popular edition. And today we're talking about the sort of evolution of that conversation, the evolution of programmatic TV, and Ben's got quite a lot to talk about today because there's been a lot of announcements from the IAB and a lot of evolution around the space itself. So Ben, first of all, how are you?
Hey, Ciaran, I'm great. Happy to be back. I don't know if it was the last one was epoch defining, but I'll take it.
Oh, come on. In terms of ad tech, it was. It was in terms of ad tech, it definitely was.
Cool. I'm glad to be doing another one.
All right. Well, let's kick off. I want to talk about sort of programmatic TV itself, right? And particularly publishers. How do most CTV publishers monetize their CTV ad inventory? All right. You talk about there is obviously a big distinction between direct and programmatic. So let's just jump straight at it because I'm quite interested to see what your perspective is.
Absolutely. Let's do it. Boom. Magic.
There you go. The virtual Trader Talk evolves.
That's right.
Itself. It's great.
Yeah. The virtual whiteboard. And this is a diagram. I'm starting with one that is going to be familiar to people who watched our last show. So I'm happy to dive into some details. You're right. There's a lot that's been happening in the programmatic TV space. And I figured after our last call, there was a lot of people interested in learning more about how a programmatic auction is run on CTV. What are the specificities of that? So that's why we'll dive right in. And I thought before we talk, for an hour about programmatic, why don't we start with direct, just to give a quick reminder of how does a direct campaign work, right? So what I have here is an example of a typical campaign setup where you have an advertiser that sends offline, really, the details of a creative to a campaign manager. So you're going to have a media file, right? You're going to have trackers. You're going to have all sorts of things in this. It could be an email. It could be, faxes. We've seen all sorts of ways that direct campaigns are happening. Now, what happens in real time? So in real time, somebody turns on their TV. So the first request, and please refer to our last Trader Talk TV. I'm not going to go through all of it again, but really the first request goes to an SSAI server. The SSAI server fetches the content stream, retrieves it, and delivers it to the TV. When there's an ad marker, so when we get to an ad break here, the SSAI basically calls the campaign manager and says, hey, I have a user watching a Samsung TV here in this case. What do you got for me? And the campaign manager, so this is on the publisher side, right? That's what's really important is here there is no direct connection happening. This is all staying on the publisher side. We'll return the creative and then get that inserted into the TV. So there's an offline process that happens for creatives to be sent, and then everything really remains in the publisher side of things. Now, if we compare that to how programmatic works, so in programmatic, you've got the same. You still have an advertiser at some point that makes an offline decision to run a campaign, right? Gets it ready. Usually, that campaign is going to be trafficked or configured within a DSP, or in some cases, a buy-side ad server. But really, it's about the DSP that's going to be making the decisions in real time. So if we go back to this chain, you've got, same deal. SSAI goes, fetches the content stream, gets it back, returns it to TV. When an ad break comes around, we make a call to the ad server. The ad server sends, bid requests to SSPs. The SSP sends bid requests to DSPs. And the DSP is the one that's going to decide whether or not to run something, right? So if the DSP considers that, okay, this is a user I want to target, then what I'm going to do is bid on here. The SSP is going to send that response to the ad server. the ad server is going to return it to the SSAI, and the ad gets inserted here into the stream. So the big difference is that it's now up to the buyer, and this is just what I wanted to illustrate, to make the decision on when to bid, which is why it's so important to know what the hell are they bidding on, right? Because otherwise you have a very little chance of understanding when is a buyer actually willing to spend to buy your inventory.
I think you've got an envelope there. Is that referring to the targeting parameters that the buyer has? This is the Gmail thing, or is that just
it's just my little Gmail icon to show that it's an offline process. So it's something that's happening not within milliseconds like the rest of this chain.
What do you think that some of these publishers have or inventory providers have been sort of like delaying the lean into programmatic when it comes to CTV? What's the sort of like barriers? I mean, obviously the market is quite complicated. We all know that. There's a legacy of like direct deals. Programmatic is pretty nascent in space. Why do you think there's a reluctance? Is it just legacy trading deals, or is it sort of the technology hasn't really been in place to make this happen?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, the best is to really dive a little deeper into this programmatic auction here, and understand, what's happening, because that to me is the reason. What's happening right here is the reason why we see so much private marketplace deals in CTV, and the number that's getting thrown around is 80 to 90% of all programmatic spend in CTV is PMPs or PG deals in some cases. So it's a lot of it. And I think the reason is this. It's that if you ask a publisher, so we'll say this is our publisher here, to tell you what they're selling programmatically, the truth is they've most likely never seen the painting they're selling at the auction. So a programmatic auction is really just like an art auction, right? You've got a piece of inventory. Instead of a painting, it's an ad slot, an ad pod. You've got an auctioneer, right? Like Publica, for example, that's going to run this auction. But the problem is the seller, most of the time, has never seen the painting. It's a completely white canvas. And so then when you ask them, why aren't buyers spending programmatically? Well, it's kind of hard to answer if you don't even know what you're selling, right? And what you're selling is this. It's a bid request. So this is how, billions of dollars are being transacted today, is because you're sending this and someone in exchange is saying, I want to pay you for that. It's kind of funny to me to think through that a little bit, because it's, we're selling an ad placement, but really when computers talk to each other, this is what they're sending. So this is an OpenRTB bid request. And what I was thinking of doing is just walk you through, what's in it. And I think understanding how it's structured and what's actually in these bid requests will help answer the question of why isn't more inventory sold programmatically, and in particular through the open auction. So here on the right side, you've got the just the basic structure of a bid request with all of the important objects. I haven't taken all of them, but I've taken, let's say, the most important ones. So the first one is an impression object here at the top. The impression object is actually probably the most complex. So I'll dive a little bit into it, but it's basically, this is what it looks like if you expand it. So this here comes from this. It's got a video object. Well, first, it's got an ID, which is basically just saying how, what's the particular impression object, referencing it. It's got a video object, which we'll dive into. It's got a floor price here, $21.3. It lets you know if the request is supposed to be secure, HTTPS or not. And then it's got potentially a PMP object. Within the video object, this is everything you'll find within the video object here. So quite a lot. Things like the MIMEs, which is the accepted formats, min duration, max duration, width, height, things like where is it positioned in a stream? Is it a pre-roll type of ad, or is it during an ad break, which is most often the case in live TV? Things like the min and max bit rate, And then you could have things like a tag ID, another floor. I mean, and by the way, the floors should match here. That shouldn't happen. And that's really what's in the video object. Then you've got the PMP object here, which comes from this. And the PMP object tells you, okay, is this a private auction or a public auction? Meaning, if it's a private auction, then only the whitelisted bidders can bid on this inventory. So this is where you get here in the W seat. It's a whitelisted seat, which gives you agency 1, which might have a different floor. So maybe this agency is allowed to bid at a different floor. So all that is what you find in the impression object. You then have the app object here, which is going to give you things like the bundle, the store URL, the category, the publisher, the content, device, which is going to give you the things like the user agent. And by the way, no one should memorize all this. There's a great spec, published by the IAB. So I'm just kind of quickly whizzing through it, but it's really about looking this up, I think, if you're a publisher.
Why?
Yeah.
So that's quite a lot of data, right?
Yeah.
For any buyer to make a sort of informed decision as to whether to buy or not, buy the impression or not. Is this being passed by the publisher, or is it a case of it's not? Because it just seems to me there's quite a lot of data there that would make a buyer go, "Well, this impression is worth buying. This video impression, this TV impression is worth buying."
Yeah. So if you had all this would be a gold mine, right? But here's kind of the reality. Out of 4 billion ads that we deliver a month, which is 96% CTV, this is the occurrence of parameters. So you've got parameters like US privacy, do not track, which are present 100% of the time. COPA, we require them. So that's great. We have them. Now, if you look at this trend, though, it starts to decrease very significantly as you get into parameters like, things like the bundle already not at 100%, right? And then when you get into content data like genre, rating, you're getting only half of impressions have a content rating. It tells you if it's PG-13 or rated R, right? For example. Now, if you get here, pod information, 25%, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but most buyers have absolutely no idea if they're buying a pod or if they're buying, a particular slot in a pod, who they're going to run against. They don't know the language of the content, right? Which you could say, well, that's pretty important if I'm going to run an ad. So that's the problem right here, is that there is just too many bid requests that don't produce the content signals that buyers need to buy on the open marketplace, which is why they go to PMPs, because it's much safer.
So how do you remedy that, though? That seems like an obvious thing to start first, to kind of like move away from PMP. What's the sort of obvious things you could do as a publisher, as a buyer, to make that easier? Yeah.
So there's a few things that you can do. The first one, which is what a lot of companies are focused on these days, is contextual enrichment. So as you saw in that last slide, one of the big problems is the context of the where the ad is going to run, right? So when you talk about contextual enrichment, you essentially have a few ways to do it. I'm going to restart at the user flow, because I think it kind of helps understand. When you turn on your TV and you go to Pluto or Samsung TV Plus or wherever you're watching your content, the first thing that happens is the TV says, "Hey, I've got somebody trying to watch, CBS News, for example. So I need to go get that content and deliver it to them as quickly as possible." In this initial call, you're going to have a lot of information that comes through. You're going to have, information about the user, like, maybe their IP, their user agent. You're going to have the bundle of the app. You're going to have potentially even the content, right? So is it PG-13, for example? Right. All that can go in that initial request of the SSAI. So that's usually the first place where we start, is saying, let's make sure that when you call the SSAI, even if it's not for an ad at this point, just for content, that you're declaring that content to the server, because then we're going to be able to use it within the bid request, right? So that's the first one. The second one is when you deliver the stream to the SSAI and then back to the TV. Here you're going to have HLS markers, which very often are SCSI markers in this place. You can define content attributes in the SCSI markers. So that's another place where you can say, hey, this is, a business news segment, for example, that's happening right now, and it's PG-13. So that's number 2, is working with the play out, whoever is building the content stream, say, hey, in your ad markers, make sure that you define these content params so that when the SSAI server needs to make an ad request to the ad server, now I'm able to say, hey, this is, a PG-13 ad. I'm not sure what happened there. But yeah, basically just giving you that information here, right? So that's number 2, is making sure you've got in your SCSI markers all the context that you need. The third one is the EPG. So that's electronic program guide. So it's what every programmer, every live channel is going to give you, a program. Usually it's what you see when you turn on your TV and you're trying to pick a show. This EPG can be shared by multiple players in this space. It could be sent to the SSAI server so that the SSAI server knows it. It's obviously sent to the device as well, so that if within the app you can access, the EPG is a big part of every streaming application. But it can also be sent to an ad server like Publica, so that in real time, an ad server is able to say, hey, I know that it's 8 p.m. on a Saturday, so this must be the business news segment right now, right? So that's number 3. And I would say that 1, 2, and 3 here are all things that a publisher can do to start enriching these content signals in the bid stream. The last one is you can work with a third party. So a third party can come in and basically deliver the content metadata to the ad server. That's usually how it's done. So it's going to be companies that index content, integrate with the CMS, and then are able to say, hey, content ID 123, this is a business news segment on CBS
right.
News, for example.
Right. Interesting. So, I mean, those are kind of like starter points that publishers inventory and use to help buyers access programmatic inventory. Just changing the gears a little bit there. I mean, obviously the OpenRTB spec, the latest spec was released in IB Lab this week or last week, sorry. And there was a feature on they've introduced ad pods into sort of the data piece of it. I'm just wondering why that is important for buyers. So, I mean, because that's like, for those who's not au fait with the sort of CTV sort of inventory space, it's a critical piece of the of sort of inventory. Talk about that. I'm curious about that, Ben, a little bit, and then talk about the types of breaks introduced. So, structured ad pod, dynamic ad pod, hybrid ad pod. I mean, these are things that I have just seen, but I'm not aware of. But just for the audience, give us a breakdown on why that's important and how that would work for buyers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of my, I'd say, kind of battles, but also visions for the programmatic TV space is not to reinvent everything, right? I think a lot of people try to say, TV's broken, we got to change everything. I absolutely don't agree. I don't think TV is broken. I think TV's worked incredibly well for the past 80 years. And really, our mission is to just make it more efficient and help publishers monetize this inventory programmatically. But the basic things that they've been doing, like selling an exclusivity, making sure, selling a first position in a pod, selling the last position in a break, selling the first spot when there is a critical moment in sports, like overtime or, penalty kicks, whatever it might be, like, that's what we have to build programmatically. And so the very first step of that is to let the buyers know, hey, what's the ad break, right? I'm not just going to tell you, give me an ad. It's this user. It's, hey, this is what this user is watching. This is, they're in California, for example. They're watching the Super Bowl that's coming in a couple of weeks. And here's how many seconds are available right now for sale. There's 100, let's say it's 120 seconds. Well, you want to let the buyer know because they might want, who knows, maybe to buy out the entire pod for a higher price than combination of ads. They might want to buy the first slot for a premium. They might want to buy out a category. So they might want to say, I'll buy this, I'll pay a premium, but only if I can be the only insurance commercial running, right?
Right.
And so in the OpenRTB 2.6 spec, what was introduced is 3 different types of ad pods that a publisher can use to monetize their inventory. The first one is what we call a structured ad pod, which is kind of the basic version, which is just tell me how many slots and how long they are. And as a buyer, I can choose to target one of them. I could also choose to target all of them, right? And say, hey, I just want to return my ad. I don't care where it runs. And that's usually how you have a higher chance of delivering, obviously, and so on. The second one is what we call dynamic ad pod. So that's when you define that 120 seconds. I'm much more in favor of that because I think you can, obviously, it creates more flexibility, in a fast pace marketplace where every bid at every dollar per second matters. It's very important to be for the buyer to have that information. The publisher is going to optimize on a dollar per second basis, right? So if two 15s make more than 130, the publisher will take 2 15s, right? If they have the right ad server, we'll say. But that's super important. So that's the one I'm in favor of. Then you could have things like a hybrid ad pod, which I think is good, that was introduced. We don't see that use case a ton, but it's the case where you'd say, hey, I want my break no matter what to start with 2 15s. You could also define rules around those 15s, which could be cool, like saying, okay, my first break is going to have to go to an insurance brand. So you can actually block other categories or whitelist the insurance brand. And then you give flexibility for the rest of the break to say, hey, now the rest is 90 seconds. You want to go ahead and throw 6-second ads in there? Great, we'll take that. So that's what was introduced in 2.6. It's right now in open public comments. I highly encourage the whole world to take a look, make suggestions, but more importantly, adopt it in a few weeks once it's out of practice. I think it's well.
I quite like your synopsis of that, which is evolving programmatic around the existing TV ecosystem, because as you say, TV isn't necessarily broken. It's just how do you make TV more addressable and introduce more supply demand sources into the ecosystem. But it's good that has been addressed. Quickly about the sort of secure aspects. A couple of new things around making supply more secure, particularly around authenticated connections, delivery devices. Why is this important? And what does it mean for buyers and sellers?
Yeah, so this is a lot of work that we've been doing with the IAB Tech Lab. We recently launched the Ad Cert suite, which is basically a series of specs that one has been released, which is the authenticated connections. And then we've got 2 more that we're actually working on with the group. And the idea is basically the following, is to say, we're in a server to server environment here, right? Where what's happening in this chain. So I'm not going to go through all of it again, but we now understand, SSAI calls ad server, SSPs, ads are returned back to the SSAI. The SSAI server very often is going to be the one that's sending out the pixel. You could also have pixel initiate from the client side, but what's important is that the advertiser is actually pretty far removed from what's happening over here. And so that creates all sorts of problems. We've seen a ton of fraud schemes. Also, the fact that just the CPMs are high. It's just all the fraudsters are entering this space. So the generic idea around security is to say we're not going to go backwards. We're not going to ask TV apps to implement JavaScript libraries to measure things. We're not going to allow VPaid. Thank God, we don't want to go back to all that world. But we have to get better at securing this space, because that's also why an open marketplace is not being used in CTV, is because the buyer says, I'd rather do a one-off PMP with the different sellers that I trust than bid on these obscure bid requests that are reaching my endpoints and I don't really know where they come from. Well, that's what we're changing. We're going to let them know where they come from. We're going to let them know you can trust it. And we're going to give them a confirmation of that when an ad is delivered. So the first one that we released with the IAB Tech Lab is the authenticated connections. And what that does is it gives a way for two servers that are talking to one another a means to authenticate themselves. And so the SSAI server is going to sign, for example, an impression pixel before it's sent to the ad server or before it's sent to the verification provider. And by signing, I mean, I encourage everybody to go check out the spec. It's a cryptographic system that's designed between public and private keys. The great thing is the Tech Lab has open sourced the code to basically build this thing. So it's not like you have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to implement it. And as a result, as an advertiser, I could say, okay, I know that this ad was delivered by Publica SSAI, for example, or anyone else, which is kind of the first step, is to prevent SSAI spoofing. So to prevent someone from setting up a fake server, just firing beacons into the wild. So that's the first one, is connections here. Then you have what we call authenticated delivery. And then you have authenticated devices. So the basic idea here is to say, okay, now I know that the SSI server is trusted, but what I want to make sure that there's no malicious player in this chain. So delivery basically uses so if this is the key, which I think I drew wonderfully last time, delivery is the S chain. So it's the idea that in these bid requests, you're going to have a chain, a supply chain object that's being added. So in what I was showing earlier, and that S chain is going to be also signed so that if anybody tampers with the content, the buyer, the receiving server will know. So that prevents the type of fraud where you could have, an exchange take in a request from, it could be web here, but by the time it gets to here, it could be Roku, for example, and then it gets to the DSP, right? So that would get highlighted as no. The S chain has been tampered with. I know this was a web impression initially. So that's the second spec we're working on, basically just ensuring that the content that's being sent in the bid request hasn't been tampered with, and you can track the entire supply chain. So as a buyer, you can know which SSP went through, which DSP went through. The last one is devices. That's probably one of the most important ones, is basically securing this part. So I can trust the SSI server. I can trust the parties involved in the exchange. But what if at the very beginning someone set up a bot farm? They bought, let's say, 1,000 TVs and start running them all the time. Well, you got to have a way to identify trusted devices, and that's where today we're really relying on the manufacturers themselves to make sure that in these requests, or if they are responsible for firing pixel, that they're able to sign them as well. So they're able to say, hey, this is a trusted device, a trusted Roku, it's got maybe a serial number. The whole point is to make sure that you're doing that in a very privacy compliant way, which is why cryptographic security is usually pretty interesting, because it gives you a way to exchange and trust the source of a particular event without having a permanent ID, for example, that could be used with anything else. So that's usually, that's the path we're going down, but I encourage anybody in the space to get involved, because I think this is absolutely critical, is securing this chain if we do want programmatic TV to live up to the standards.
And is that being adopted is that in the market right now, or is it still being tested?
So connections is in the market right now, which I think the adoption is still relatively low because we released it only a few weeks ago, and these two are being built right now. So not out for public comments yet, but any member of the Tech Lab can come and contribute to these work.
I think the buyer community would be quite interested in that, given the fact there is a lot of fraud in the ecosystem, and there's no doubt about it. High CPMs attracts a lot of bad actors. So something like
absolutely.
I want to wrap up today to talk about sort of like the new inventory on the block, right? So obviously TV has been dominated by broadcaster inventory, a lot of particularly around the sort of the upfronts, etc. And now the sort of AVOD, the fast type inventory is getting the same kind of targeting variables, measurement variables, etc. What does that mean for the industry? Are we going to see more money sort of being distributed away from traditional walled gardens into this program ecosystem? Or will we see new money come in as well, particularly from, data-driven buyers who are looking for the TV inventory but not willing to pay the sort of top prices in the upfronts?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot happening. First on the upfronts, my personal take is that I think the upfronts are going to change over the next few years. I don't think it's going to be, once a year we agree on the shows that are coming out. That just the cadence of even content production has gone so much faster, and the entry of new buyers, to your point, Ciaran, of it's not now just the same 200 advertisers that are buying every TV spot. It's hundreds of thousands of advertisers that are getting involved. Yeah. So I think it's going to be much more seasonal. There are still going to be ways for programmers and content owners to broadcast what they're coming out with, what's going to be released in the next few months. But I think the execution is going to be programmatic more and more. And as a result, it's going to allow smaller players to enter this space, right? Because you're by going programmatic, by doing, by making this open marketplace a reality, you're now no longer limiting big budgets, right? You can have someone come in with 10 grand with a hyper targeted campaign on, the type of content or an audience or whatever they want to target, but really enter that space and market their product. And to me, if we give that type of targeting criteria and we lower those barriers to entry, then it's not just about traditional buyers, moving budgets over to CTV. That's important. That's going to continue to happen, but it's more about all those social buyers, people that are finding a lot of success on Instagram, Facebook. Can we start to prove to them that you can see the same success by targeting the biggest screen of the house, the best content available, and that's going to be our challenge, is first making sure that the targeting criteria are available. So everything we just talked about. And then I think, and maybe it'll be the next session, is how do you measure ROI? How do you actually prove to the advertiser that they are going to sell more goods by running their ads on CTV versus Instagram?
But the performance piece is going to be interesting. ROI, definitely. Addressability, measurement is going to be interesting. And we can go into that again, I guess, in the next episode, whenever that is. Yeah. But thanks for that run through, Ben. That was awesome. Again, it's just interesting to see the evolution of space. As you said, TV is a well-established branding channel, and this just adds a layer of data-driven aspect to it. And it's interesting that you're able to increase the number of buyers, which is the exciting part. You're democratizing the access to TV, which is good for, I guess, the publisher and great for the buyer as well.
That's definitely the goal. Yeah.
All right, Ben, thanks for your time again, and I hope all is well in LA. Is it LA you're in? Is it LA?
San Francisco. The Bay
Why do
Area,
I get this mix up? So San Francisco. I do apologize. We'll bleep that out and rerun that one now. Ben, thanks, and I want to thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time on Trader Talk TV.
Thank you, Ciaran.